Hello, I'm Ted Morrissey, and this is a video for our course on classic sci-fi and horror by women writers in the Lindenwood University MFA in Writing program. I'll begin. We'd been put in the mood for ghosts that evening after an excellent dinner at our old friend Colwyn's by a tale of Fred Murchard's, the narrative of a strange personal visitation. Seen through the haze of our cigars and by the drowsy gleam of a coal fire, Coleman's library, with its oak walls and dark old bindings, made a good setting for such evocations and ghostly experiences at first hand being, after Murchard's brilliant opening, the only kind acceptable to us. We proceeded to take stock of our group and tax each other member for a contribution. There were 8 of us, and 7 contrived in a manner more or less adequate to fulfill the condition imposed. Right, as we know, that is an opening to Edith Wharton's short story, The Eyes, and published, I believe, in 1910 originally. Yeah, June 1910 in Scribner's Magazine. And I wanted to start with that because I'd also like to share this opening with you. The story had held us round the fire sufficiently breathless, but except the obvious remark that it was gruesome, as on Christmas Eve in an old house a strange tale should essentially be, I remember no comment uttered till somebody happened to note it as the only case he had met in which such a visitation had fallen on a child. The case, I may mention, was that of an apparition in just such an old house as had gathered us for the occasion, an appearance of a dreadful kind to a little boy sleeping in the room with his mother and waking her up in the terror of it. So that is the opening to Henry James's classic The Turn of the Screw, which was published in 1898. So a little more than a decade before Edith Wharton's story. Now, James certainly wasn't breaking new ground in terms of telling a ghost story or framing it in that way. So I'm not trying to suggest that Wharton, copied James or whatever. But I did want to talk about Henry James in particular, and I kind of used the notes that I sent you as sort of jumping off point for that because Edith Wharton, even today, is often talked about as a sort of protege of Henry James. And based on that article that I shared with you, that isn't really true. They were certainly contemporaries, they knew each other. As you know from the notes I sent you based on the article, Edith Wharton seemed to regard Henry James in a more collegial way, and not that she was his protege per se. Henry James, on the other hand, he may have, viewed Edith Wharton as something of his inferior, perhaps, but certainly maybe a younger author that he was sort of mentoring. So maybe they had different views of the relationship, and Henry James's view seems to be the dominant one. Of course, that speaks to all kinds of issues in our culture, in terms of the patriarchy and so forth. But nevertheless, I think there are some really interesting things going on in both Edith Wharton's story and in Henry James's story, The Turn of the Screw. And I want to use that to sort of, like I said, underscore some of the other things we've been discussing, not just in connection to Edith Wharton's story, but other issues we've been looking at this session. So, yeah, Edith Wharton, unlike a lot of the authors in the anthology that we've been using for the course, is still very well known. Her works are widely read. Her novels widely read, widely taught. Several movies have been made based on her novels and short stories, and so on. Fun fact: Edith Wharton was also a poet. She's not really known for her poetry today so much, but One of my favorite poems is actually a poem by Edith Wharton, a poem titled Terminus. You should look it up. But like I said, a lot of the other writers in the anthology, unfortunately, have sort of fallen by the wayside in terms of popularity and contemporary readers knowing their names and so forth. But Edith Wharton is certainly one of the few in the anthology that still is very well known and has quite a reading. There's a very active Edith Wharton literary society that puts on conferences and goes to conferences and makes presentations and all kinds of things like that. So one of the things that I noted there in terms of similarities between Edith Wharton's The Eyes and Henry James's The Turn of the Screw is the framing device that they both are using. And again, certainly James didn't invent it, and so Wharton certainly could have absorbed it from lots of other sources besides Henry James. But it was a very popular kind of framing device, this sort of once removed sort of narrator. In other words, we're getting a story as heard by someone listening to a storyteller. Now, it's even more complicated than that somewhat in The Turn of the Screw, which we'll talk about here in just a couple of minutes. But again, very popular kind of framing device. I used to teach The Turn of the Screw quite a bit. And I also would teach Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is very, very similar time period right around the turn of the 20th century also. And if you're familiar with Heart of Darkness, which is a great little novella, long story, whatever you want to call it, very, very similar framing device to The Turn of the Screw. In The Heart of Darkness, we have an unnamed narrator who is a passenger on board the ship, and the ship is just outside London, and they're having to wait for the tide to turn in order to take the ship into London and dock. So they've got some time on their hands. So Marlowe, one of the other passengers, starts telling the tale of his experience in Africa in search of the ivory trader Kurtz. And so Heart of Darkness is a story told to us, again, sort of once removed. So we're witnessing, hearing a storyteller named Marlowe telling the story of Kurtz and his experience with Kurtz, right? So it's not just, so Marlowe isn't the narrator, it's someone listening to Marlowe. And so in The Turn of the Screw, we have a narrator who is listening to a story in which the narrator, Douglas, is reading a manuscript by a governess who had this experience. So this kind of multi-layer removal. But why that was a popular framing device at that time period, not sure exactly. I mean, in each individual piece of literature is certainly worth talking about. And when I've taught both The Turn of the Screw and Heart of Darkness, that's one of the things we talk about is why would Joseph Conrad or Henry James have done that? We can ask a similar question of the Edith Wharton story, even though it's not quite that extra layer removed as these other two works. But the other issue I want to bring up that's something we've been talking about throughout the session is this idea of ambiguity when it comes to the ending of a story, or really ambiguity throughout. And The Turn of the Screw is a great example of the potential popularity because of ambiguity. I think we talked in particular about this when we read Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, that it's this highly anthologized story, but yet there are some elements in it that to this day, more than a century later, we're still not quite sure what it means. And I think, oftentimes as writers, we think we have to be crystal clear about everything in order for it to be a successful story and to get published and have people read it and respond to it and all those kinds of things. And certainly in some areas of literature, that's true. I think in a lot of genre literature, whether it's mysteries, particularly where you have to solve who done it by the end of the story, or whether it's a romance or a western or something like that. I think oftentimes there is a sense that the author needs to eventually put all their cards face up on the table, and we all have to know exactly what's happened and why it's happened and those kinds of things. But a more literary kind of story often sort of traffics an ambiguity, and that is actually something that sort of adds to its allure and its popularity over time, as we try to make sense of it and so forth. So again, as writers, I think we you know should feel okay with ambiguity. We shouldn't feel, unless again we're trying to target a very specific kind of writing, we shouldn't feel obliged to necessarily spell everything out. I think that sometimes we think that stories that are ambiguous because the author has decided to make them ambiguous as a sort of, I don't know, a scheme for their popularity, for marketing or something like that. And in reality, the writer knows exactly what's going on. They know exactly what has happened. They're just kind of keeping some of the cards close to the vest, so to speak, and not letting us know. But I don't think that's always the case. I know for me it isn't. I traffic in ambiguity all the time in my writing, and I am just as in the dark most of the time as a reader would be. I don't know why a character is doing what they're doing. I don't know what an ending means exactly. I don't know what's going to happen after the story is over, and it sort of continues in some sort of theoretical, time space or whatever. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I have a hint, and I'm being a little bit cagey by keeping that from the reader. But most of the time, not. As like I said, I'm as in the dark about what's going on and exactly why it's going on as anybody, which perhaps lends an air of authenticity to the ambiguity or something like that. So, The Turn of the Screw, as you may be familiar with the story, novella, whatever you want to call it, is famously ambiguous. Henry James was prolific, wrote tons of stories and novels and novellas and essays and reviews, and he was a playwright, and on and on and on. In fact, he wrote so much he got in a terrible case of what we know today would be carpal tunnel syndrome, to the point where he couldn't write anymore by hand. It was so painful. So he ended up having to hire a secretary, a young man that worked for him, and he would the last several years of his writing life, he recited his stories, composed them verbally to his secretary, who would write them down, and then once they got into a printed form, type printed form, he then would start to work on revising them and things like that. But very prolific writer, and a lot of his work is still very popular. Even today, many of his novels and stories have been made into movies and that kind of thing. But of all of his work, The Turn of the Screw remains the most popular in terms of having the most contemporary readers, generating the most scholarship. If you are a Netflix horror series fan, maybe you watched The Haunting of Hill House, which, of course, the original season was inspired by Shirley Jackson's classic novel by the same title. But then the second season of that series was The Haunting of Bly Manor. I forget what it was called exactly. They changed the name a little bit, but it was a retelling of The Turn of the Screw, kind of a modern retelling of The Turn of the Screw. And this has been made into multiple movies over the years, many, many movies over the years. So very, very popular, but yet we don't even really know what happens in the story. And so I want to read a little bit about that, and about the ambiguity and how it seems to actually bolster the popularity of the text and so forth. Before I get into that, however, in kind of a related note, I just want to read a couple of little sections here, and then I'll get into the idea of the ambiguous nature of the story. This is in the about this volume kind of introductory section. This is the Cambridge, isn't it? No, sorry, Bradford St. Martin's Critical Edition, edited by Peter G. Beidler. And he writes this in the sort of opening introductory material. He says, the turn of the screw has been to critics a chameleon text, taking on a coloring that lets it blend in with almost any way of reading it. Depending on who is reading it, the story can be a Gothic tale in the tradition of Poe, a romantic tale in the tradition of Hawthorne, or a realistic tale in the tradition of Howells. That's William Dean Howells, of course. It can be a Freudian tale of sexual repression, an allegory of good and evil, a detective story about murder and deception, a call for better treatment of children, or a reflection of hidden truths about its author. It can demonstrate its author's knowledge of scientific research on ghosts or his rejection of that knowledge, his accord with the social structure of his time, or his rejection of those structures. It can be read as a Marxist statement, a feminist statement, or a gay statement. So frequent and wide-ranging have been the published interpretations of the turn of the screw that critics do not feel the need to identify either the author or the name of the story in the title of essays. A title like The Mysteries at Bly is sufficient to reveal to most readers that this article is about Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. In part 3 of this volume, and I'm going to actually read a little bit from that in just a second, I present, in addition to my essay summarizing the critical history of The Turn of the Screw and Ross Murfin's fine introductory essays laying the groundwork for contemporary critical approaches, 5 essays by eminent critics. Wayne Booth has written an essay discussing reader response criticism and how something he calls ethical criticism works in this story. Greg W. Zacharias has written a paper with a psychoanalytic slant applying a Lacanian approach to literature. Priscilla Walton has written a gender-based essay in which she shows how feminist and gay readings can work in The Turn of the Screw. Bruce Robbins shows us what a Marxist reading makes of the story by having us pay attention to the various social classes represented at Bly. Finally, Sheila Tehan uses several of these and other approaches to discuss the variety of readings of the story as well as the role of reading in the story. Taken together, these 5 essays, following my summary of the critical history of The Turn of the Screw, show the richness and the complexity of one of the most widely discussed pieces of fiction ever written. I wanted to read that, among other reasons, because obviously it speaks to our focus, or at least our secondary focus on critical theory this session. So it's definitely something that is used in literary study. Oftentimes it isn't spelled out quite so blatantly as this editor does. And I don't mean that's a criticism of the editor. I'm really glad, he spells it out, because for our purposes, it really underscores, what we've been talking about. But oftentimes, when these various theories are talked about, they aren't talked about with those specific labels, but clearly they are, different approaches that are still very much in the forefront of criticism today. And they definitely can help to shed light on a text, particularly something as complex and enigmatic as The Turn of the Screw. So when scholars, critics are approaching literature, they definitely tend to come at it from these various, different sorts of lenses. And notice that oftentimes their approaches are sort of hybrid approach. We've talked about that as well, that oftentimes we don't just take a feminist approach, but a feminist approach maybe combined with queer theory approach or whatever it might be, right? So kind of a hybrid approach is oftentimes very, very fruitful as well. All right. So kind of along those same lines, let me flip to that critical history of the turning of the screw that the editor mentions, and this partly gets kind of back into the idea of various critical approaches, but more importantly, it really emphasizes that idea of ambiguity and how ambiguity has actually perhaps made this the most read and discussed Henry James story of all of them, and a lot of them are discussed a lot today. So the fact that this is at the top of the list really says something. He writes, the fundamental question dealt with in the scholarship of The Turn of the Screw is how real the ghosts are. And sorry if you're not familiar with the story, it's kind of a spoiler, but still should read it if you haven't, because there's a lot going on besides what I'm about to read here. So again, how real the ghosts are. Are Peter Quint and Miss Jessel real in the sense that they are spirits of the dead come back to haunt the living? Or are they real only in the sense that the governess has hallucinations that make them seem real to her? Do they haunt the children, or do they haunt only the governess's troubled imagination? Virtually every book and article on The Turn of the Screw, and there have been hundreds, deals at least indirectly with that question. It is almost impossible to read the story without taking sides, and almost impossible to approach the story critically without knowing where one stands on it. Indeed, that question, and the fun that scholars and their students have had debating it, has elevated to star status what otherwise might have been seen as a rather ordinary James story. The two basic readings are so radically different and so apparently mutually exclusive that it is amazing that both sides have agreed on one essential fact, that The Turn of the Screw is a wonderfully successful story. It is amazingly fine. It is an amazingly fine, creepy, scary, soul-shuddering ghost story, or, alternatively, it is an amazingly fine psychological case study of a neurotic young woman. The fact that the two readings seem mutually exclusive, how, after all, can a woman be both sane and insane? How can ghosts be both real and imaginary? Has not prevented a third position from emerging in recent years, that The Turn of the Screw is at once both a ghost story and a psychological study. Those who argue for this third or dualistic view also agree that it is an amazingly fine story, fine precisely because James has told it with such skillful ambiguity that readers can hold both views simultaneously. Just going to read a bit more here. Because of this rich disagreement on how to read it, and because of the paradoxical agreement that whichever way we read it, the story is brilliant, The Turn of the Screw is Henry James's most frequently read, taught, and discussed piece of fiction. The story compels us partly because we all want to discuss our own ways of answering its commanding question. Is this or is this not a story about ghosts? Related questions are sure to evoke spirited class discussions and interesting papers. Can we trust the governess's perceptions? Is she sane? What is the purpose of the quote-unquote prologue? Are the children innocent or corrupt? How does Mrs. Gross know from the governess's description that the ghost is that of Peter Quint? How does Miles die? Is this a story about sexual coercion or homosexuality? Is there a best way to read this story, or are all ways acceptable? So, yeah, so we really have very little idea what actually is going on in this story, and part of the fun of it, the joy of it, is trying to figure it out. Even though James never gives us the right answer. Obviously, a sort of traditional mystery story, whether it's a Sherlock Holmes story or an Agatha Christie, story, or whatever it might be, obviously there is that kind of questioning, that ambiguous sort of thing throughout. When we're introduced to characters in a mystery, everyone seems guilty at first, right? And then we might, for a while, think it's this person, and then we might think it's that person, and then eventually they're kind of crossed off our list, and then in the end, here we are with the answer to the riddle. Who's the murderer, who's the thief, et cetera, et cetera. But in this story, we have all those ambiguities going on throughout the entire story, and then they're never answered, right? And the editor here suggests that it's a skillful sort of ambiguity. In other words, it's not ambiguous because Henry James meant to help us along and just wasn't very good at it, but rather, he knew that he was being cagey and not giving us the answers, and yet that was, what he intended, and it worked beautifully. So again, I think that sometimes we're encouraged as writers to know exactly what's going on, to know our characters, as well as we know our own parents or something like that. And I know I've been advised, when I took workshops and things like that, that I might want to write dozens or even hundreds of pages about a character's biography just to sort of get to know them, even though a lot of that information might never end up in the short story or the novel or whatever it is I'm writing that they're a part of. Yeah, I don't do that. I don't do that. I sort of let the organic process of the writing teach me about the characters and who they are. Um, I think I've mentioned before that when I wrote Crow Song for the Stricken, which is a series of stories or episodes that kind of all work off of one another to form a novel, a prismatic novel, I've called it, that I literally sort of let each story sort of dictate where I was going next. So if I talked about a character in a story, and alluded to something that happened to them, oftentimes that would then spark me to write the next story slash episode where I explored that. And what is that about? At the time that I originally said it, it seemed like there was something going on, but I didn't know what it was myself. So I had to write another episode to kind of explore that. I've kind of taken that idea to a whole nother level in my current project, where it's much more tightly organized around a singular event of a snowstorm, and then there's two kind of families who have similar sorts of conflict going on, and then it's a very tight time frame of about 72 hours or so, and so I've kind of reeled in, sort of bracketed in the time frame and the scope of the story, but the process has been very similar, where each news story slash episode is from a different character's, not from their perspective. It's all in third person, but focused on a different character's experience within the bubble of this novel's time frame, and oftentimes they are interacting with each other, either directly or indirectly, and I'm just kind of figuring out who they are from episode to episode, and so on. So anyway, again, sometimes we need to know what's going on, and sometimes we want to let the reader in on it, but other times we might be deliberately ambiguous, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think, particularly in terms of an ending, an ambiguous ending can be very attractive. I tend to like those best myself, not only as a writer, but as a reader. But it could be a whole darned book is ambiguous. We don't really know what's going on or why it's going on, but yet we like it. We like what we're reading, and we like thinking about it and maybe arguing about it with others who have read it, and so on. Just very, very quickly, I want to throw in a little additional stuff on Henry James, but through the lens of my literary idol, William H. Gass. By the way, this is just a little extra tidbit of info here. This is a kind of a proof copy of the William H. Gass Reader that his publisher Knopf produced before the book was completely done. I had reviewed other books by Gass, or one other book by Gass up to this point, and so I was kind of known to Knopf as a reviewer of Gass's work. So they sent me a copy of the book before it was published, like a long time before it was published, like a couple of years before it was published, and it's very, very similar to the book that ultimately came out, which I'll show you in just a second here. But one of the ways, sorry for the page flipping, one of the ways it's a sort of a rough draft is there's no page numbers. So this lists all the various things that are in the book, but there's no page numbers because they still hadn't completely decided yet what the order is going to be for sure. Also, as they proof read the pages, if you even fixing sometimes one little typo or something on a page can throw off the pagination, can adjust the pagination. So you basically wait till the very, very end to do the table of contents. But I ended up writing a really long review. Why wouldn't you? Write a long review of the master, but published at North American Review's blog, so you could look that up if you wanted to. But yeah, this was the William H. Gass Reader. As you know, a reader is a certain kind of anthology where it takes bits and pieces of a writer's work over their lifetime and puts it all together in one book. It ultimately was published as William H. Gass Reader, also available in paperback, which I also have, by the way. But it is pretty comprehensive. His fiction, his essays, his craft essays, and so on are represented here. One of the shortcomings of a reader, oftentimes, is that the fiction, especially that's included, oftentimes is abbreviated. It's not the whole thing, and that's kind of true here. But Gass oftentimes wrote even like his novels and novellas in sort of standalone narrative chunks, and they were widely published in literary magazines, particularly the literary magazine Conjunctions. But and then many of them won awards like Pushcart prizes, Best American Short Stories, the O. Henry Award, and so forth. And so even though some of the novels are only excerpted here in the reader, they still have sort of standalone narrative quality. So I definitely recommend getting a hold of the reader. But one of the pieces that's in here is a really interesting piece that Gass did called 50 Literary Pillars, in which he wrote about the 50 books, not specifically authors, but books that he felt in retrospect, he wrote this towards the end of his life, that he, looking back on his reading experiences, these were the 50 books that definitely impacted his thinking, particularly his thinking about literature, his thinking about writing, and turned him into the writer that he became. Actually, there's 51 here. This was actually done for a program at Washington University. He was a professor there the last 20 years of his college career or so. And it was supposed to be 50 literary pillars, but at the last minute, he realized, oh my gosh, I forgot Freud's dream interpretations. And so he literally wrote it by hand on the program. And so his 50 literary pillars actually include 51 entries. A little fun fact there. But Henry James actually has a couple of them. So I thought as long as we're on a kind of a James side road here, I'll read you what Gass had to say about a couple of James's works that were particularly important to him. And one of them is Henry James's The Golden Bowl. Gass writes, "Here is the last phase and what the last phase can do. James was born in a late phase and grew phasier all his life, like a jungle vine." I love Gass. By the time he was truly old, he was beyond time and need not have marked his birthdays. The Golden Bowl, the critics said, was James indulging himself, James parodying James. Critics are a dim lot. It was James being James right enough. I could have listed half a dozen of his novels, from The Portrait of a Lady through The Spoils of Poynton to The Wings of the Dove and The Ambassadors, or half a dozen of his tales, and called upon his travel work as well, so that to place only the great bowl here is a bit perverse. I do so because what affected me most about Henry James lay not in some single work itself, but in his style, that wondrously supple, witty, sensuous, sensitive, circumloquacious style, and the bull is that style brought to its final and most refulgent state. Like the French author Valéry, in the realm of the mind, James was a nuancer and believed in the art of qualification, the art of making finer and finer distinctions, an art that some have said is the special province of philosophy. Gass was actually, his PhD was actually in philosophy. He taught philosophy at WashU. And Henry James formed the phrase, the slogan, the motto, which I would carve on my coat of arms if I had one. Try to be someone, he said, on whom nothing is lost. So really focus on observation. He is also supposed to have said at the moment of his death, so here it is at last, the distinguished thing. What he actually said, of course, was, so here it is at last, the extinguishing thing. People will embroider. And then the other entry he has for Henry James is Henry James's notebooks. And Gass writes, the workshop of Henry James was the third major classroom of my writer's education. Flaubert's letters were the first course, Gertrude Stein's lectures and stories made up the curriculum of the second, and James's notebooks would constitute the third. What a workshop it was! Transmutations were made there an alchemist might envy. I could see how James's fascination with gossip and social trivia was transformed into his burning moral concerns, and how these, in their turn, were refined in a manner of writing so scrupulous, so delicate, so reflective, it became an indictment of the very material it had arisen from, as if the door of the roast were to blame. I'm sorry, as if the odor of the roast were to blame the pig for being pork. Like Proust, James knew how to read and how to write the language of society. Like Proust, too, what he wrote was devastating. To look in this book is like looking into the master's head, into that majestic dome, in order to watch the cogs, only these cogs don't simply go click. So I guess the other thing I would kind of point to, and this goes to the question that I posed to you with the notes on Wharton and James about whether or not you have a mentor, a writing mentor, or have had a writing mentor, or whether you have a particular writer that you admire, so you study their work to try to learn from it. For me, that definitely is Gass. Obviously, I've picked up a lot of things from other writers, but for me, Gass just really clicked with my own sensibilities about what it means to be a writer and also a teacher and a thinker and everything else. And so I've definitely been focused on his work in the last 12 years or so, and it's really made a huge difference in my own writing, particularly. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I'd be happy to know your thoughts on ambiguity as a narrative choice, on the framing device that Wharton and James and others use, or more about mentorship and writers that you have learned from, or specific books that you've learned from. If you were going to do your own 50 literary pillars, maybe at this point you can only do 5 literary pillars, but what would they be, perhaps? All right. So I will stop there, and I look forward to seeing you down the digital road.